Ben is a hall director at Minnesota State University Mankato from the UMR region, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about supporting our international students. So thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Alyssa. Hi all. Pleased to meet y'all, even though I don't see your faces and such. We're just gonna jump right into it. I'm gonna load up my presentation and all that good fun stuff, and we'll get started. Um, mhm, 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 mhm. I think I got it figured out. Can people put in the chat if you are able to see the presentation itself?
I can see it. It's good.
Okay, wonderful, awesome. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Ben Dorweiler. My pronouns he, him, his. Presentation on supporting our international students. This is a subject matter that I'm like very passionate about because I am one. I was one. So with that being said, we'll get started. Just a quick overview of what we're going to be covering. It's the terminology aspects. First, like who is Ben? Why am I speaking on this subject matter and such? Some common terminology things that is just very important to understand when we are supporting our international students to like be familiar with the verbiage that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, potentially even. Understanding the pre-arrival process of like what is the frame of mind that our students come in with, what are some of the barriers that they had to overcome, get through in order to even arrive on our campuses. Then barriers, I'm going to be doing some questions for y'all like in the chat of like what barriers do you know as an individual that you like have heard or just know of. Then the fifth section is things that you can do as an individual in your area and what we can do together. And then a quick reminder at the end. So with that being said, we'll go start. So first, who is Ben, right? I was born in Germany. I got the German flag behind me and the Dutch flag. Born, and then 3 months after that, I moved to the Netherlands. Our family moved, and I grew up in the Dutch school system. Dutch school system is different than the American school system. I came to MSU Mankato 10 years ago, which is wild to say, on a F1 visa, which is the student visa for full-time students. I then went to go on and do my graduate degree down in Kansas at Kansas State University. This also still on an F1 visa as a student, and was doing my graduate assistantship with housing and dining services. And I worked and did a semester long working and supporting the International Student Scholar Services Office down there as well. With F1, there's some things that you can do afterwards, and I was able to work full-time as a hall director here at MSU Mankato on my OPT, which is my optional practical training. And very fortunate enough that my department was willing and able to apply for an H-1B visa, which is a specialty occupation visa, and it got granted. So I am now in my second year on my H-1B visa and my third year as a full-time professional here at MSU Mankato. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. The important part to remember is I'm not an expert. I know a lot of things from my personal experiences, but also because of graduate school, I did some research about what international students would like to see be better. That was like my research project for it. But the world of immigration is vast, and it changes sometimes yearly, but definitely when there's new administration and elections happening, there's always new guidelines. So keep the information that you're learning today in mind of like, you are not hearing from an immigration expert, but someone that has just lived it and did some research on it with students and with peers, and is sharing a little bit more about that. So just some things to keep in mind. Now, some terminology. There's some important terminology that I want y'all to remember. First of all, it's the SEVP, the Student Exchange Visitor Program. This is the program that allows the tracking of the international students whenever they come into the country of the U.S. That's housed under the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. That's a very important thing. That's the program. All the information gets housed and held in SEVIS, which is the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System. So whenever students' accounts are linked with immigration, with like their status, with how many credits they're taking, if they are potentially in violation of it and such, that all gets updated in SEVIS. So that's a very important thing that students and schools will navigate with. Now, who can access SEVIS? This is a DSO. If you have international students on your campus, that means that you have a designated school official, at least one of them. They have to go through the training and all of those things. I don't know all the ins and outs, but they need to do things in order to be able to be a designated school official for that. That sometimes is their sole purpose. That can be also multiple, a person wearing multiple hats, and DSO is one of them. Now, an I-20 is a document that students get once they are admitted to a program or a university, and they need to start the process to gain a visa. This is a certificate of eligibility for non-immigrant student status. Certificate of eligibility is basically the prospective student has provided to the said school the funds and all the requirements in order for the school to be like, all right, yes, you are able, financially able and such to attend our school. Here's the certificate of eligibility. You can now get the process of your student visa and get that ball rolling. Now, F1, I already talked about it. F1 is a non-immigrant student visa. This varies from 1 to 2 years to the full length of study. When I was on F1, my F1 was granted for 5 years because I was in a 4-year program, and they typically give a little bit more in case things happen in life. So that's an F1. So whenever you hear students talk about F1, that means that they're here for an extended period of time. Then OPT, I alluded to it, is optional practical training that allows the student to apply to jobs that are within the field that they graduated. You get it at a bachelor's level, master's level. Whenever a degree gets completed, they have OPT. Now, I graduated my master's, I got OPT, I used my OPT. I can get another master's, but I don't get OPT again. It's only per level that you get that. Depending on what field you are, you get 1 year or up to 3 years. I got a 1-year thing because I was not in the STEM field. So that was kind of a quick turnaround in order to apply for the H-1B, which is the work visa. Now, what does the I-20 look like? On the I-20, this is what a typical I-20 looks like. A lot of information there, but it basically really, in a snapshot, covers all of the important things that the student and the school talked about and provided. So country of birth, date of birth, the school name, all the addresses, the education level, what the major is going to be, if there's a second major declared already, what's the program start date, and what is the anticipated program end date. And then the financials, so like, all right, we estimate tuition and fees will cost this much. Living expenses, typically in the first year, like international students might choose to live on campus. That's then a good chunk that needs to be listed as well. And then expenses of the dependents if they come with partners and such. Then important part is like, how is the student going to fund to cover those costs? Quite often, it's personal funds. Open Doors data shows that almost half of the students that come to the U.S. Is personally funded. Now, there's also other funds like scholarships and all of these and programs from governments that provide some of the funding, but personal funds is a good chunk of it. And sometimes there's on-campus employment already, like a graduate assistantship, that will cover a chunk, as long as the total number is exactly the same. And then there's some paperwork and signatures. involved with that. So this is what a I-20 looks like. And the service ID, top left corner, that is literally the ID number for the student that is connected with the student, that is with them for the entirety time that they're a student or within the Department of Homeland Security. Now the next part, J1, you might have seen of like, what about exchange students? Exchange students get a J1. That depends on what it is. Sometimes that's typically for a semester, but they can get it for more than just a semester, up to 7 years, depending on the sponsorship. But typically you'll see the J1 if they're like for a semester or 1 year. That is what I have seen in my years here in the Midwest, at least. Now, sometimes there is also CPT, so students need to do their internships or they need to get work experience to complete their degree, and they need to go off campus for that. That is where curriculum practical training is. That is like in order to advance and finish their degree, they need to get CPT granted in order to do internships and work experience off campus. As you may or may not know, like students are limited to work on only on campus parts, and they're also they have some limitations with how many hours they can work, which I'll cover more in a little bit later. These are just some of the acronyms and the terminology and such. There is a lot more, but I'm not going to throw that at you because this is basically providing a baseline of where I want the knowledge to be at for today's session. Now, the pre-arrival process, you can imagine quite some anxiety, like moving to a new country, sometimes without family and without any type of connection prior to it. Such, this is kind of what that process looks like. The process looks like is there are testing, COVID allowed for some flexibility with certain things, but English proficiency and tests need to be completed. So that's the TOEFL, the EELTS, the ACT or SAT. These things need to be completed in order for the US school system or the application to be able to assess like, where do we place you? What classes do you still need to take? They got to get all those scores in because they got to provide those materials then to the school. So then they have to go to apply to a SEVP certified school and institution because they need to be connected with that program. They provide all the things and hopefully they get the acceptance results, and that shows the I-20 form. Then the institution produces the I-20 for that student. Typically, they got to show a proof of funds for at least 1 year to make sure that, like, all right, you have enough in a bank account or access to the funds to sustain and pay all the bills associated with 1 year of being academically enrolled. Once they got the I-20, that's where the visa process starts. So you got to pay the visa fee, which is $220, give or take, sometimes more, and they got to apply for the visa. There's a whole question list associated with that, a very quite intrusive question sometimes, but some students have shared of just like, have you ever had these things, yes or no, and they all have to be like truthfully, and it's about like a 6-7 page term. 6 or 7 page of just questions that you have to answer as well. If this is the first time getting a visa, typically you have to do an interview at an embassy or a consulate, at a U.S. embassy or consulate in the country that they are from. They have to sometimes provide additional documentation, make sure that they have all the documents with them, and then have that interview. Mine personally was about 15 minutes, but it can be a lot more stressful and longer depending on what country they're from and such. Hopefully they get the visa, they leave their passport behind, the visa gets stamped in the passport, and then 5 to 10 days, business days later, they get the passport back to their home address and they're good to go. They got to bring all of the documents, the I-20 they got to bring with, all the proof of funds, all of these things, they have to bring those and for their travel. Travel means traveling and arriving at a U.S. port of entry. For this scenario, we'll just say like they flew in, and then the Customs and Border Patrol officer is the final authority of admittance. So they're gonna ask questions. They're gonna like, what are you here for? Like, I had to show my first time entering the country 10 years ago, show the proof of funds and such. So, but if you're unable to provide those documentation, that officer has the final authority to say like, you're not coming into the country. Which you can imagine can be quite stressful. You already traveled so far, and then there's the person at the border that can still decide, uh, regardless if you have all the paperwork or not, that like we're not going to admit you for whatever reason. Um, Hopefully they get admitted, and then arrival. Students can arrive up to 30 days prior to the start date of their program. So that's like the start date that is listed on their I-20, up to 30 days early. So typically you might have seen international students that have done some traveling already in the country, and then orientation. And that depends on each institution, how that orientation is set up. Yeah. So now, kind of like a checkpoint of I'm inviting you all to put in the chat, in the webinar chat, of what barriers do you currently know? What barriers are you aware of? This is also a good gauge for me to know like what knowledge there is in the room currently. So please, I'm gonna give like 5 minutes. Please put all in the chat. What barriers do we know? And I'll read them out loud once we have a little bit of a list going on. While people are typing, I'll read out some of the things. Yeah, required immunizations. In order to be able to enter the country, there are certain immunizations that people need to have, depending on what part of the country or the world people are entering from. Travel costs, healthcare insurance costs, financial barrier right there, right? Plane tickets are expensive, really expensive depending on whereabouts they're coming from, and the healthcare insurance costs. Some schools require certain healthcare provider that need to be purchased. I'm assuming Cato had the United Healthcare insurance, and that was just a requirement to need to have purchased such. Visa, admissions processes, and housing applications. Yes, not being familiar with processes, what's the verbiage that we're using? Something like, oh, people will definitely understand this. Like, will they understand it from their cultural lens? Unclear. If traveling as a family unit, working through multiple visas at the same time, yeah, you can imagine like having that amplified, and traveling with just more than just one person, there comes a lot more dynamics to that as well. Ability to get food you're used to and comfortable with, or difficulty adjusting to food, absolutely. Food is quite different here. I had to adjust to a lot of sodium that the US typically have in their food, and I had to step away from milk because the milk was quite different, just as an example for that. Getting insurance, phones, banking situated. Yep. Learning how to navigate a new city and place. Absolutely. Exchange rates change. That is a huge one. No transportation and affordable housing near campus. Affordable housing, and then how are you going to make it to the campus, especially with no transportation? What additional costs are associated to make it to campus then? Um, Finding housing off campus if there's no space on campus, especially if your campus that gets filled up quite quickly, or you have a housing requirement or anything like that, or like the residency requirement. How is that going to look like then for our international students? The language, and I'm assuming that was banking. The language is a huge barrier for our students. Not being able to tour the school prior. Yeah, hopefully, potentially, your institution does some great social media engagement and marketing things and videos. And despite the best videos, unless you're walking the campus, you truly don't know how you're going to fit in or feel on the campus until you're actually there. Getting connected to a community, finding peer support, moving in after hours, that's a huge one. And then barriers to the transition process in general, social cultural, the homesickness, prejudice on campus, mental health concerns, academic with the different school systems, and economic, changing economic status and funding from home country. Yes. And then also know the depth and breadth of the academic resources available to them. Absolutely. So all some really good things. These are the students. Here's some numbers. I'm going to go into like barriers and all that stuff. This is the most up-to-date data of Open Doors data. It's an Institute of International Education. They track all of this and they get all of this information. Compared to last year, 2021, 2022, 11.5% increase. So we have over a million international students at that time, which pretty certain that we're quite on the same trajectory for this year as well. This is huge. There's a lot of students that make up the international student population that we have on our campuses. There's a breakdown of like where our international students are from. Awesome. So barriers. I listed a few things here. I'm going to go into more detail. Is cultural barriers, financial barriers, maintaining status, and educational barriers. Obviously, there's multiple more barriers, but those are some of the ones that I have listed. Cultural barriers. You can imagine new country, new laws and policies, drinking age, cultural norms. In one country, it's totally allowed to be driving a scooter or anything like that, and like here, no, there's certain things with a license that may not be acknowledged here with a driver's license. Food, are our students able to cook their own food? Does their kitchen or the rest all have a kitchen? Then do they have access to the foods from home, the comfort food, to make sure that the big gap of missing home and all the things that come with it, are they able to supplement and get that comfort? The weather is a huge thing. Weather, you can imagine, like we have international students that have never seen snow. Me being in Minnesota, my first year, we had a lot of like students from Brazil that never saw snow, and that was quite the experience for them. But that means also like how well prepared are they with their clothing? Like a cold jacket for the winter in one country could be maybe just a windbreaker in the US. Transportation, just like it was mentioned in the chat, public public transportation can be very confusing. It's in a different language. There's different systems. A system that makes sense and through the lens of a U.S. System versus a system that might be very confusing to an outsider, to an international student. Communication specifically, like besides the language barrier, which is a huge one for a lot of our students. It's also like, what are some cultural communication things? Like I learned with the Midwest greetings, like, hey, how's it going? It's not actually people asking how things are going and being invested in how your day is, but that's just the hi, there might be some other cultural typical communication things in your regions that you maybe now are starting to think of, like, oh yeah, we do say these things where there's not really the intention to engage further and such, or sayings that have a different meaning than for an international student. Cultural awareness. There's a lot of knowledge online that students can find things, but domestic students sometimes don't have the cultural awareness of what are common practices and sometimes religious type, but also just culturally type with things. That is a huge barrier that I've heard students say of like domestic students don't understand that this is my normal and are unwilling to learn and adjust and educate each other about it. Huge missing support systems is another barrier. Missing support systems like family, friends. You can imagine a 7 or 8 hour time difference. You might have seen it in your spaces where students are up at 2, 3 a.m. because that's the only time where they might be able to connect with mom and dad or with friends back home about things that are happening. That is a vicious cycle because they're seeking out that support, but at the same time, they're not really getting adjusted to the time zone here and the regular flow of things, then sleeping in, and it impacts a lot of things. And finding a support system here can take a while. Mental health stigma, as was mentioned in the chat too, absolutely, right? Like there's more and more talk about mental health and counseling, but that might be even within domestically, within families where like there's certain topics that like you don't typically talk about, and that's culturally and in other countries definitely also true. So like if there are struggling with adjusting to life on campus or in the US, and then there's also the struggle of like being raised like to not talk about mental health issues, and that's a huge thing to circumvent, to get through, to able to talk. Values are very just different depending on locations and experiences. And then religion, not all holidays are celebrated. In the US, there's only like a few compared to the worldwide holidays and such. So tough to see maybe a holiday or religion celebrated in an area where international students are at, where theirs is not, or not even recognized or appreciated or supported. This is also based from some online things, but also with talking with our current international center here at Mankato of like what are some of those barriers they navigate. Financial barriers is a huge one. So here's some employment things. International students on an F1 visa, undergraduate students we're going to go about right now is 20 hours a week. That's the max that they can work because it needs to make sure that academics are still the primary focus. They can only work on campus. Students are not allowed to work off campus. If they are working off campus and they don't have OPT and such, that means that they are breaking their visa requirements, are in violation technically. Getting a social security number in order to be able to work and get a paycheck, that can take a while. Sometimes requesting social security number when students are in between places because they're just moving from main campus to off campus. Where's that social security card going? My first one got lost and I had to reapply for a new one because I never received mine. Those are some stressful things if we're in the process of getting an on-campus job or starting training in that. Scholarships, not all scholarships are applicable to the international student population. There's some grants, some federal grants that they're just not eligible for. There's maybe not a lot of scholarships or support for students to get. Now there's some nationwide grants and things that they could apply for, but sometimes it can be tough. Health insurance, a few people talk about health insurance. Health insurance, we're required to have health insurance, so we purchase health insurance, but the fear or the information of like healthcare costs a lot, like don't get sick in the US, there might be like huge financial repercussions to it, which then might result in students not being able to finish college. This is a very real thing. Especially at age 18, 19, if they're like doing the traditional route, do they truly know what is covered under the health insurance? I had to learn real quickly what my in-network and out-of-network means and how that can be drastically different in costs and such. There's not much education and talk about in an academic setting, because that's not really the part of the curriculum and such. So a lot of things that international students have to learn outside of the classroom just to be able to exist and utilize the resources that they have. Someone already said it, but currency value, whatever's happening back home, the euro at some point dropped very drastically. When I came to the US 10 years ago, it was almost a euro was $1.47. And at one point during my academic career, it was almost 1 to 1. You can imagine that if students make certain financial plans with their families, especially if it's from personal funds, the money that they originally had might not last as long as it needs, and it can pose then some huge barriers on like, all right, how am I going to pay this bill with the institution or anything else? Those are some things that can impact and create those financial barriers. While I'm talking, feel free to put things in the chat if there's some questions or anything like that. I know I'm talking quite a bit about certain information things. Now, maintaining status is like, they gotta remain full-time student, undergrad or graduate or such as is important. That's one of the requirements to maintain. There's a certain GPA requirement, just like remaining enrolled in the class and at the institution. And not all classes are allowed to be online. There needs to be a certain ratio of in-person versus online, which some programs might have like, oh, we provide a lot of flexibility, like it's all online, like, ooh, no, I can't do those things. Like I need to have in-person aspects. During the COVID time and the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty and changes, and luckily it allowed students to take online classes and such. But has been slowly but surely rolled back and such. So now that was a real thing to balance out. So certain semesters can be really busy, and certain semesters is just taking classes to maintain that full-time status, because yeah, that one class is offered online in the fall, but in person in the spring, and I need to wait until the one in the spring. Open-ended versus multiple choice test taking. Coming from a school system where there was not as much multiple choice things, but more open-ended, more to like explain the why, and even if the answer is wrong, you might get almost full points. And here, majority of the things, depending on my degree, there might be different experience for a lot of things, like multiple choice, like they might have not been used to multiple choice or the open-ended or vice versa. That's a tricky space to be at. Collaborative work, in group work, group projects, I can imagine we all probably had an experience where like not everyone is pulling their weight and all that stuff, and where you might have to be one doing it. Collaborative work, group project means communicating, means maybe talking in English where English is still not their strongest language. Working with domestic students where they might not have the patience or the understanding to navigate some of those barriers that they're experiencing with the student. That then collaborative work can be a huge barrier. And then in addition to that, not really understanding of like, can I go to professor about this? Is this professor receptive to these things? So such things. Plagiarism, depending on where they're coming from, there might be common practice of like, oh, it's okay if you find the information online, like you just cite it in a certain way, but here then it's like, oh, you didn't cite it correctly, of like, no, you pass this off as your own, where just not understanding what that truly means, like at the start of the academic year, upholding the honor code and making sure that you're not plagiarizing, is saying like, what does that truly mean? How does that truly look like? And then the next part on the educational side is workload. This is a thing that during my like research with some of and conversations with peers, there's just a lot of work sometimes, not necessarily quality, but more of just doing a lot of things, and that where on top of the language barrier and just learning the system, they are struggling with just the amount of work that needs to be completed. This is especially true for undergrad, but also graduate school, with the load that they have to complete and just not being used to that because there's systems. I can only speak from my personal thing from the European side where it's like, oh, we have a test at the end of the period, at the end of the semester, and we have like one project and that's it. And it's more like it's up to you how you're going to fill up that semester, making sure that you provide the end product that is looking for that is needed. Versus here, it's like every week, all the homework, all the assignments, all the readings, all the quizzes on top of that, then the lockdown browser, making sure that all of that is followed. There's a lot of things that get done and happen on this side that doesn't necessarily happen on in their country. Now, here are some things that you can do, and you might feel like, okay, there's like I'm going to learn out the cheat code on like how I can support the students. You might recognize some of these things are not that. There's no magic cheat code on like how you can support international students the best. Here's some things that I've listed though. On an individual basis, taking the time to educate yourself and research. From the housing lens, if you're aware of international students being from a certain country, take some time to learn about their customs. Are there currently some events or wars happening that might impact their family back home, maybe their financial situation, or just the overall stress level about like my home country is in war or there's economic downfall happening. Taking 10 minutes to truly understand what's going on can inform your conversation and future interactions because then that student may not necessarily have to educate you every single time, as taxing as it is on them, about what exactly is going on at home. Being aware of world events like earthquakes and tsunamis and such, like if a person knows like, ooh, there's a flood happening currently in that country, checking in on the student of like, hey, I know like you're from a country doesn't mean that you're necessarily from that region on stuff. Is your family okay? Are your friends okay? How are you doing? Like, how powerful is that to showcase like I'm aware where you're from, I'm aware that there's something's going on, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're impacted, but I'm just here to let you know I'm a resource. Promoting and going to events of students, of all students, right, but also of our international students is very important. Promoting and going to these events. You're amplifying their voices. Then learning the names. So this is something that you might have seen more commonly as well, westernizing a name because domestically we're struggling to pronounce their names. Quite often taking the time of like, okay, you want me to call it like this? What is the name that like, how would I pronounce your name? Some international students really want to really assimilate in the culture and would prefer you to call them by the name that they're sharing with you, and that is great. Some international students really take pride in their name and they just had to change their or give like a Western style to their name just so they can just move on with the initial question of like, oh, where are you from? Oh, that's a unique name and such, right? What you can do as an individual is learn the names, learning to pronounce these names correctly. What you can do in your area, depending on things, and if you do programs, create programming that focuses on sharing of cultures. That does not necessarily mean asking our international students to like, hey, you're from this country, talk to us about the country, right? Like that's very taxing and that's not what we want, but maybe creating opportunities where cultural exchange is possible, domestic students can teach about some common familial things that they had to navigate, but it could also be just bringing in some certain typical things from other cultures where people can engage with it and it's not as taxing on the students themselves. Now, intentional reach outs electronically, sometimes we have students from different identities, whereas I like just checking in, and reaching out, especially like once this semester gets going, the ball gets rolling, small fires pop up left, right, and center, and all of our students are navigating things, but sometimes that intentional reach out of like, hey, checking in, like there's a lot of change that you've had to navigate this past month, how are we doing with that? And passive programming, like bulletin boards or newsletters and such, educating our students in that way. There might be some concerning things happening in your area or on your campus where maybe some passive programming to educate about like what does this mean? What is this? I'm a big proponent of like being proactive in these things, and hopefully like we're not doing passive programming because something happened, but we're doing passive programming to ensure that there's understanding instead of judgment. Then inclusive programming, this is with all programming, right? That we talked about right, in student affairs of like we want to make sure that it's accessible for everyone. Like if there is programming that is like geared to a certain culture, like making sure that like anyone that has maybe never interacted with that culture or content has a way to start in the process. Now, then together, what you can do is working with the international office, listening to them and working with them, inviting them to come create programs together or anything like that. Maybe hearing from them, like what are some things that they hear, students, they have their international advisor, they might share some concerns and such. Ensuring references and examples are culturally inclusive. Just because something is very popular in your region does not mean that anyone outside of your region will understand that reference. Inside jokes, it's the same principle, inside jokes, but if someone doesn't know the joke, then an inside joke is very in and out grouping it. So we want to make sure that if we use references or examples in trainings or presentations, that anyone can understand them. And then educating and preparing the students about future changes. So we know how we typically see the flow of an academic year, like once winter hits, if you're in the Midwest, that, the seasons change, how that impacts. In the middle of the semester, we have midterms, some of our students, even domestically and internationally, might not understand like how significant maybe a midterm is because they didn't read the syllabus, didn't understand that that's important to prep beforehand. But you can do some educating of your students, of your CAs, RAs, or student staff about things that are happening in that way, to make sure that like you're being proactive instead of reactive all the time. Now, communication. Communication is a key thing, especially because English is typically not the first language of our students. These might be very like, oh, duh, of course, Ben, but they need to be said. Is do ask questions and clarifications. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, because your lens, that word or that phrase might mean completely different, and it turns out that it was meant completely different from the student. Being open-minded towards that, connecting with them and educating yourself about your student. That's really important. The don'ts is like, don't judge. There might be phrases or customs that in your region is like, ooh, we don't do these things. We don't. That's typically not, like, well, you can't say these things. Educating them, instead of judging them. Don't stereotype. Don't take it personally. There might be, I've had interactions with students where they only know a certain thing about my home country, and they said things, and it's really tough, But that's all they know. Like international students talking about, soccer is a big thing. The Netherlands was a big thing in soccer and stuff. Like Netherlands is more than just soccer. But if that's the connection piece, like, all right, let's talk about it. And don't assume things for our students. All right. Now, if you are interested to learn more, here's some things that I encourage you is like IIE, Open Doors, the opendoorsdata.org. That's a really great starting point. You can look into the Student Exchange Visitor Program through ICE. There's professional organizations that we have nationwide, internationally, and your international office probably hopefully has some resources already listed of like what our students get. Good starting point is always to learn the information that we share with our international students, because then you have the baseline of the information that they have. You have context, which they probably don't, but then it provides you like, right, this is the information that they receive from us. How can I make sure that the rest is informed? Now, reminder is when you've met one international student, you have met one international student, right? It is very important to remind ourselves of like, just because people are from the same country, just like domestically, does not mean that one, they know each other. Maybe they've done orientation together, doesn't mean that they pass cross. Some people come with different schools and such. Just because they're from the same school doesn't mean that they know each other and stuff. You've met one international student. What is true to one international student's experience does not mean it's true to the other international student's experience. That is all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing and basically open up to any questions. And if you want to put it in the chat, or if you want to talk to me, just let me know. There was a question here. It's like, is anyone seeing requests for bidets on campus? We haven't seen any requests for bidets and such, but there was definitely the ask of like praying spaces for students to be able to pray and making sure that their religion they can practice in an appropriate space and such. Yeah. What questions do we might have? Question: pros and cons of an international living learning community on campus. You can imagine creating a space where there's peers, they live like a similar experience, being able to talk to peers about like, I'm noticing all of these cultural differences, or is that like, have you navigated this? Like, is this just me, or is this a thing that is happening on campus? Can be very powerful, right? Just like with any of the other learning communities that are maybe like identity based, can be very powerful. Making sure that we're not requiring our students and such to do it. Like, if you have a learning community coordinator or office, to connect with them, like how best to move forward to make sure that it is communicated also in a good way to our international students with orientation or with the materials of like, hey, this is optional. I had the option to be part of a learning community, and I was like, no, I don't want to be part of the learning community. What if I'm just going to be surrounded by international students and I'm not learning domestically the culture? That's what you sometimes see, where international students connect with each other a lot because there's a shared experience, and then they end up learning a lot about other countries, except for the domestic country, which is the US. So there's some resource sharing that's happening in the chat, or like asking questions, there was one statement made earlier about early arrival. If you have early arrival, like after hours, what do you currently have in place? If a student arrives at midnight, like, can they still be checked in? Do you have a person on call that can facilitate that? Here in Mankato, there's some changes where there's some student global ambassadors that like some student staff that are covering our housing office for check-in for international students. So it wasn't an additional load necessarily on housing staff, but we were still providing like connection piece. Can we do 24/7? Probably is not the best, right? Because there's only a few students, not all the flights are coming in and such. But those are some things to think about of like what do we currently have in place, and where is a barrier that we created unintentionally, and can we remove that? There's a question about, does anyone have pre-orientation programs to work with international students to arrive early? I'm not orientation and such, so maybe there's some humans that want to share or maybe relate to a QI, like, ooh, this is a great resource that maybe can be created and such. Yeah.
There's one question in the Q&A that I can read.
Right.
It says, we have an international student RA specialty staff. What types of things would you recommend they be trained in or programming that would work well with that group?
What types of things would you recommend to be trained in? Um, or programming that would work well with that group. Uh, International student party specialty is mm, I think communication is huge, right? You know, like how can you approach the communication aspect best? Um, if students are not the most comfortable with the English language yet, you know, there's translating apps and stuff. Like, can we still have that in-person connection piece, things? There's cultural awareness assessments, you know, making sure that hey, culturally aware of like what are some common practices, you know, if someone is not looking a person in the eye, there might be some cultural background of like that maybe in their culture it's disrespectful to look in the eye, you know, and to like really navigate those differences in that part. Um, Making sure with programming that we communicate maybe instead of just all virtually or verbally, also making sure that things are written out and maybe talking some slower and maybe really simplifying it a little bit to make sure that that first connection point is accessible, right? You know, my assumption is really tough, you know, and like where do you start? But if we start like from point zero and then work through it, you know, especially for a programming model in the RA world, you know, maybe the first programs is really low entry, low risk, you know, something that might be even familial in those countries, maybe encouraging them to research like, oh, here's some games that might be named differently, maybe have a little bit different rules, but it gets to the same thing. You know, it's like, oh, we have something similar here. Then there's some overlap, and then they can recognize that. If programming starts with something very domestically specific, you know, unless you have students that are like, yes, I'm going to embrace everything, you know, those are the students that are going to do fairly well with assimilation because they're saying yes to a lot of things. But typically, it's very scary to try this really new thing where they have no concept of what that is. I hope that kind of helped. Otherwise, you can email me as well if needed. I'll gladly work through. Again, I am not an expert. I lived and worked through it, and I provide a certain perspective that you may not have otherwise in your area.